Hi, Anthony. We'll get started in a couple of minutes, in about 11:03. Just see if anybody else joins us. Okay, let's get started. Good evening. So welcome to the second session of Business Communications at Qualifi Level 3, the Certificate in Business Management. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week and cover a number of topics related to corporate communication. I suppose just to remind ourselves from last week how important communication is. It's everywhere. Everything we do is affected by our communication skills. All of our businesses and activities are influenced by what we hear and what we see and what we encounter. So communication is very, very important to us. So the learning objectives of this program are on the screen there in front of you. So the first thing is to understand different types of business communication, then to know how to present business information effectively, which is what we'll be talking about today. Then next week, we'll be talking about understanding the limitations in relation to the use of business information. And finally, we conclude then in 2 weeks' time on how to communicate business information using appropriate methods. Obviously, the skills and the capabilities are changing all the time in terms of how we actually communicate. So if we break those, if we then look at under those learning objectives, some of the assessment criteria. Last week we talked about how organizations use different types of information, and today we're going to focus on different types of information from a corporate perspective. As I said last week, communication is an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions, or emotions by or between two or more persons. And of course, two or more persons includes organizations. Organizations are legal persons. Communication is also the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. So communication is both the content and the process. And when we talk about business communication, we're talking about facts which are provided or learned about a business, about its internal environment, about, who's employed, how it does things, what products it has, what services it has, and its external environment in terms of its customers and its suppliers, its regulators, as well as about its intents and its plans. So business communication allows business managers to make decisions based on what they find and what they discover, and also to plan and to control all functions of their business to move the business forward. So that was a recap on the last session. So we had this exercise just at the end of the last session around what were the sources of business information. And the challenge was, if we were taking over a business, what would we need to know? What would you need to know if you were taking over an accounting practice or second-hand car dealership? or a restaurant. Well, you might want to think about it on a number of different levels. There's a couple of examples on the screen. The first thing is, if you were thinking of taking over the business, you'd want to know what their performance was like. What was the revenue that had been generated in the business? What was the cost base? And therefore, what are the profits? In addition to the revenues, costs, and profits, you might also like to understand, well, what's the cash flow like? Because it's not just about income and expenditure and profits. It's also, what does the cash flow look like? Is there cash to enable the business to survive? Most businesses will fail because of cash flow as opposed to profits or losses. In addition, we'd want to know who the markets and the customers are. What do they need? Where are they? How are their needs being met? How are those customers being communicated with? We might also want to know about operations. Well, how does the business do what it does? If it's a car dealership, what sort of relationship does it have with the suppliers? How does it deal with insurances? How does it deal with service, particularly if it's a second-hand car dealership? How does it deal with servicing the vehicles and making sure that the cars coming in are fit for purpose going out? And of course, we want to know about the plans and the problems. What are our plans for the business? What has the business been trying to do? What has it achieved? And what are the problems? And we then need to figure out, well, where would we get the information for those pieces, for those elements? So, for revenues, costs, and profits, certainly we'll be looking at the accounts. Markets and customers, we might be looking at information around advertising that's been done, our market projections, our market plans, and we'll talk about marketing research in the next hour. In terms of operations, we might want to look at standard operating procedures, our process flows, or procedure documents. And plans and problems, we want to look at budgets, we might want to look at strategies, and we might want to look at reports around issues that have arisen. So we look for sources of information anywhere. And the recap in terms of some examples of information, we might look at a job description which might describe a job to be performed. It might come in the form of a memorandum or a document. It might be used by a HR manager or by a prospective job applicant. And it can be used by a HR manager or a business to attract candidates and to help structure the work. We could look at business information from invoices or contracts in a similar way. Or at the bottom of the screen, standard operating procedures. And the purpose of a standard operating procedure is to ensure standardized, effective operations. The type of document or the type of communication element for an SOP might be procedure maps, process maps or procedure documents, and might be used by operations managers and production staff. So there's a whole range of potential information elements that we can look at. And that's what the purpose of the course is. So moving on to today then, to focus clearly on knowing how to present information effectively and describing different types of corporate information. So if we talk about corporate information, well, what do we actually mean? Well, before we get into the detail of that, I just want to recap very briefly on how companies present their information. So there's a couple of YouTube clips there. I'm not going to play the first one, except for just the first couple of minutes, because I talked about this last week. So I'm going to
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Hey, how is that? Is that better? Hello again. Is this any better? Can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me? My apologies. My apologies. Okay, so you can hear me now. So this is a communications course, and we've had communication problems first week and second week. Next week, no YouTubes. We'll make sure it goes swimmingly. All right, so let's get back on track. We're talking about corporate communication. Why is this important, and to whom, and what are the different types of corporate communications? Okay, so first of all, according to the Financial Times, corporate communication is a management function or department like marketing, finance, or operations dedicated to the dissemination of information to key constituencies, the execution of corporate strategy, and the development of messages for a variety of purposes for inside and outside the organization. So that's a long-winded definition, but let's just break it down. So corporate communication is a management function or department like marketing, finance, or operations, or HR, or quality control. It's like it can be treated like a management department. It is dedicated to the dissemination of information. So corporate communication is all about sharing information to key constituencies. So who are the constituencies? Well, it depends on the business that we're in, obviously, but some of the key constituencies are obviously customers, because they need to know about the products and the services, where they're available, what needs they meet, how they can buy them, what the pricing is, etc., what the quality assurance is. Other constituencies are suppliers, because they have to ensure that supplies keep coming in so that their operations can continue. Other constituencies, internal, are staff, management, stakeholders such as shareholders, lenders, so even regulators. These are all key constituencies. So corporate communication is involved with the dissemination of information to these constituencies. And what this can do is this can help with the execution of corporate strategy. So that if we have a clear strategy, we can help execute that strategy by sharing information effectively with key constituencies. Corporate communication is also concerned with the development of messages for a variety of purposes. So messages are created for different purposes, both inside and outside, depending on the constituencies. So it's a long-winded, complex definition, but that's what we're talking about from a corporate communication point of view. And if I just go back a couple of slides, we need to describe the different types of corporate communication as one of the key objectives of this session. So, well, who are we talking about? We're talking about businesses from small to large. Obviously, on the screen, there's a number of logos for a range of businesses, most of which you will be familiar with. IBM, the computer company, of course. Facebook is in the news quite a lot lately. It's had lots of communication problems stemming from the fact that it has privacy issues and that there have been data breaches of Facebook's servers and customer base, which has created a challenge for Facebook in the marketplace, particularly with regulators in Europe and in the US. I'm not sure what the situation is in Asia. Alibaba, of course, is the biggest online marketplace in the world. So it has lots of communications challenges and constituencies to deal with. Apple, the failed YouTube we had a couple of minutes ago, is an example of the communication from Apple. And that particular communication was aimed all about sharing information about what Apple is about, as opposed to individual products. I'm going to come back to Boeing in a second. Airbnb, of course, is another global brand that we're all aware of. And its core business is communication, because actually its whole business is enabling communication, I suppose, and transactions between somebody who has a property and somebody who's looking for a property to rent or to stay in for a short period of time. Berkshire Hathaway is possibly one of the most successful businesses on the planet. And it's also much less recognized than these other brands. And we're going to talk about Berkshire Hathaway in a minute, because if we compare leading corporate companies and organizations with Berkshire Hathaway, we see a staggeringly different approach to corporate communications. But if I talk about Boeing for a minute, and obviously it's a very sad situation at the moment, but the current issue with Boeing illustrates just how important communication is. So I think it was early yesterday, or possibly the day before, there was a crash of an Ethiopian Airlines plane in Africa, where 157 people, I think, lost their lives. So a very sad situation, very, very, very sad situation. What's quite interesting and worrisome about this situation is that the plane crash involved the new 737 MAX aircraft, which is relatively new, and is also the type of aircraft that was involved in the Lion Air crash about 6 months ago. So the communication challenge for Boeing, and for not just Boeing, but for lots of other people, has emerged that, if this new plane has a fault, well, that creates a significant communications challenge for Boeing. So, we've already seen how Air China, I think, has grounded its Boeing 737 fleet, as have some other airlines. Ryanair in Ireland and Europe hasn't grounded its Boeing 737 MAX fleet, but it's watching the situation. But it has been forced to come out with a communication about the situation. So corporate communication has to be, it not only is about disseminating information, it has to be responsive to circumstance and to situation. So the air crash which has occurred has driven a major challenge for Boeing, as of course for Ethiopia Airlines, and its need to engage with and to keep informed and to support, I suppose, the families of the people who perished on the plane. In addition, of course, Boeing has to deal with all of its other customer base as well as the general public. There's two objectives here. One is to reassure them about the company and about the products and services, but also to do the right thing in terms of, if there is an issue with the plane, that Boeing needs to issue an advisory to ground the plane or to take certain action so that it can address an issue if there is an issue with the airline, with that airliner. So, corporate communication is occurring all the time, and central to this is understanding, of course, the communication process. So, just moving on with the definition for the Financial Times there, in today's global corporation, the corporate communication function can serve as the conscience of the corporation. That's an interesting take. The idea that a corporation can have a conscience. I'm not sure that's actually true. I certainly think that it's important for organizations to manage their reputation, but as a legal entity, not a sentient entity, the corporation itself doesn't necessarily have a conscience. But in order for it to exist and to trade effectively, it has to manage its presence and its reputation. So previously, this would have been called public relations or public affairs. And it has taken on much more importance in the 21st century as a result of many of the corporate scandals that we've seen at companies like Enron or BP, and there's lots of them. We'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. The department then that usually oversees communication strategy and media relations and crisis communications, it has a broad remit. So, if we just deal with those elements, strategy, media relations, crisis communications, like I just talked about with Boeing, internal communications within the organization, reputation management in terms of how the reputation of the organization is maintained and protected, corporate social responsibility, investor relations, government affairs. Of course, all of these elements are some of the corporate communications that have to be managed. And, what will normally happen in bigger organizations is that the chief communications officer of the firm will have a very senior role and be reporting to and part of senior management. Okay. So the reason that's important, I suppose, is we know that scandals happen. So there's just a few icons on the screen there. Just have a look and see, is there any of those that you recognize or that you don't recognize? And I just want to do another check. If you can't hear, will you please let me know? I know if one person has a difficulty. Okay. So if we look at those rounds, I've already mentioned Enron, which of course is about 17, 18 years ago now. Enron was a major energy company that went bust, and a major scandal. Basically, the company was fabricating some of its numbers and so on. What's really interesting about Enron is it also brought down Arthur Andersen, which was one of the then big four or big five accountancy firms around the world. And Arthur Andersen had signed off on Enron's books. So as a result, it collapsed. Accenture exists today and would have been the consulting arm out of Arthur Andersen, but it survived, and Arthur Andersen, as what would have been the preeminent, the top accounting partnership around the world, is gone. Other crisis situations would be Barings Bank. Barings Bank, and about 20 years ago, Barings Bank had a major issue when a trader an English trader in Singapore, a guy called Nick Leeson, ran up debts of 840 million or something. Ultimately, that led to Barings Bank, which was then a 200 to 300-year-old merchant bank, being bought for a dollar or a pound by a Dutch bank. It basically ceased to exist as a result. Anglo-Irish Bank, not too far from where I am here, went bust with about 12 billion worth of shady deals. Well, not shady deals, but 12 billion worth of losses in 2008 during the Great Recession. Ford had difficulties over a car called the Ford Pinto in the 70s and the 80s, which was poorly designed and exploded when it was rear-ended, causing several deaths. And Ford, at the time, there was a famous memo which basically indicated, which came out and caused even more of a crisis, because the memo articulated the fact that there was a cost-benefit analysis done that said it was cheaper for the company to pay out on the debts than to do a complete recall of the Ford Pinto and fix the problem. Bernie Madoff, of course, lost $60 billion on behalf of investors. He's the guy in the bottom right. And Brown and Williamson Tobacco was a subject of the movie with Al Pacino called The Insider. And it was, again, crisis difficulties associated with the fact that it knew that cigarettes were addictive. So corporate communication scandals happen. That shouldn't be the driving force for corporate communications. They shouldn't occur, first of all, and corporate communication should deal with much more than corporate scandals. But that's the stuff that we see that really, I suppose, hits the radar or resonates most. Whereas in actual fact, it should be less of an issue, and we should be dealing with much more constructive and strategy enabling elements in terms of our corporate communications. I wanted to illustrate just a couple of things about corporate communications by picking two companies, Ford and Berkshire Hathaway. So the next couple of slides are just literally just taken from Ford's corporate website. So you'll see it there. You've got a nice Ford, I'm not sure which model it is, on the screen there. And you've got, Ford vehicles, the shop, the finance, etc., located dealer. Its logo and its image are all there. And Ford is a $144 billion company. And behind that screen, there's many other screens, such as there's an about us. So our aspiration, our belief, which is feeding into their corporate communications side. And it's very much about who we are and what we're about. And you'll see this with lots of big organizations. They put a lot of work into their corporate communications in terms of having an element on their website, which feeds corporate social responsibility, which provides public information about the company, and we'll also have a section dealing with information for investors and so on. For example, there's the piece for investors for Ford. You'll see down the left there, you've got news and events, financials, where financial reports will be, stock information, so information they're required to make public by the various stock exchanges upon which Ford stock is traded, etc. So lots of other information in terms of very structured, complex website. And of course, Ford is a consumer company. And if you look at IBM, if you look at Apple, if you look at other major brands, Coca-Cola, lots of other big, large companies, what you'll find is they have similar sort of approaches. But just bear in mind that Ford is worth 144 billion. It doesn't have to be this way. There are other ways to deal with this. So, for example, if we look at Berkshire Hathaway. Now, Berkshire Hathaway is worth $618 billion. And this is its website. Okay? That's its website. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So about 15 links on it. No pictures. That's it. Okay? And you'll see there at the top, it's got Berkshire Hathaway Inc., 3555 Farnham Street, Omaha, which is Nebraska. Okay, and that's the official homepage. Okay, and if you go into any of these links, what you get is text generally, or there might be links, sublinks to some financial reports. And remember, Berkshire Hathaway is worth what, nearly 5 times, nearly 4.5, 5 times Ford. The reason I wanted to show this is that there are different approaches to corporate communications. So Berkshire Hathaway are not a consumer business. It's a conglomerate. So its primary communications function is to its investors. Ford's primary communication is to its market, to its customers, as well as to its shareholders, etc. But it's primarily using its corporate communications website as a sales tool about the company and about the products. Berkshire Hathaway is primarily concerned with its shareholders. So Berkshire Hathaway is the company which is run by Warren Buffett. Now, Warren Buffett is, I think he's 86 years old now, and he's been investing for 70 years. So since he was a teenager, he makes the point he bought his first stock when he was 12 or 13 or something. But he's one of the wealthiest guys in the world. And not because he's had a quick fix or because he's had a great idea, it's because he's been a very shrewd investor. And what's interesting about the Berkshire Hathaway website is that they tell the story on their website. This is an example of a letter in the beginning, just explaining what happened and how Berkshire Hathaway came about, and being very straightforward about the fact that they made lots of mistakes. So Warren Buffett is renowned as he's referred to as the Oracle of Omaha because of his capability around investing and the fact that if you bought a share in Berkshire Hathaway, as the company is now known, 50 years ago for $10 or $100 or something, that'd be worth over $1 million or $1.5 million now. I don't know the exact number, but it's something astronomical. Because Berkshire Hathaway's approach to investing and its approach to business is radically different to Ford or other organizations. But this is a communications module. So we're talking about communications, and what Berkshire Hathaway has done is it's taken a very clear, focused approach and said, well, our primary information customer is our shareholder. Because what we do is we take money, we buy a company, we let that company run, we may make some changes, the company generates profits, we buy more. With the income that the company generates, they buy more companies. So their business is buying and investing in companies. So their primary communications customer is their investors. And that's why, if I go back here, all of these links are linked to investor information. They're telling their story, they're talking about what they're giving information that they're required to give, but it's radically different to Ford. Okay, in terms of Ford's approach or any other corporate communication. So if we then step forward, we say, well, what's involved? What's included in corporate communications? Well, there's a whole range of activities. And this is where we start to broaden out into the different purposes and functions of corporate communications. So, just starting at the top there, we're talking about government affairs, okay? We talk about communication strategy. We talk about media relations. So government affairs, obviously, is linking with regulators, potentially lobbying of governments, which we know can be a problem as well. Of course, corporate communication will be involved in establishing a communication strategy and media relations. So some companies are really, really good at this, and some are really, really bad. There's a story about a company called Ratner's in the UK, and Ratner's doesn't exist anymore. The chairman of the company was a guy called Gerald Ratner, and he would have been, I think, the son or the grandson of the founder. And what Ratner's did was, Ratner's was a jewelry company. It made low-cost jewelry. That's what Ratner's did. And it had a chain of stores around the UK, and some, maybe some slightly outside the UK, which were high street, but low-cost jewelry, cheap jewelry, effectively. And I suppose their market was to make jewelry available to people who didn't have an awful lot of money. And Gerald Ratner committed the cardinal sin. He disparaged his customers, effectively, in a speech. He was giving a speech to a chamber of commerce or something, and some sort of organization of business people, and he made the point that, that's exactly what we do. We sell cheap jewelry. We sell rubbish. That's what he said. Because he was trying to make the point that that's their market they were in. But that got picked up and shared, and as a result, the company was ostracized, effectively, because its customers had just been accused of being, buying rubbish. So why would they go back and buy more rubbish from the organization? So he didn't think through what he was saying and to who he was saying it and to what the implications of that might be. So he wasn't aware of the immediate potential that it could have come from what he said. So within 6 weeks, Gerald Ratner was gone. Within, I think, about a year or so, the company was gone. So media relations, crisis communications. We talked about Boeing already. There have been other examples. BP, I alluded to earlier on, of course. The Deepwater Horizon. I don't know if anybody has seen the movie, the dramatization of it with Mark Wahlberg. But of course, that was a huge crisis about 7 or 8 years ago when a wellhead in the Gulf of Mexico basically collapsed or exploded, and it was a BP well, and they didn't handle it very, very well. First of all, there was the issue that happened in the first place, which was a technical and a regulatory issue, but then the whole communications around that crisis was shocking, and it led to the fall of BP's chief executive and chairman as well. So crisis communication, another function of the corporate communications. We talked about internal communications in terms of staffing, or we can talk about internal communication in terms of staffing, in terms of any sort of activity internally in the business. Obviously, the bigger the business, the bigger the organization, the more rigor is required in internal communications. If I'm running a small store and it's my shop, and I'm doing it most of the time, and I'm open from, let's say, 8 in the morning till 10 in the evening, I might have 3 or 4 staff, who work and or rely on maybe 5 or 6 staff. So I would need to sort of manage internal communications with those 5 or 6 people. But that's a much easier challenge for me to do than if I'm running a company which has 150 people or 2,000 people or 50,000 people. So the scale of the issue obviously changes the scope and the approach to communications, but the same need arises. I still need people to do their job, and I need them to be informed about what's expected of them and how they should do it. Reputation management, we talked about, is linked to crisis management, and Jared, we don't even talk about Ratner's anymore. And of course, then there's marketing communications. And marketing communications, which we'll be talking about much more in the next hour, is all to do with how we interact with our customer base and with our market. But marketing communications can include things like advertising. It can include things like how we deal with communications, how we deal with helplines or comment lines. Or I read a report last week. One of the issues with online reviews, that nobody believes them because so many of them are fake. I can set up a new business, a new website, or a website supporting my business with reviews on it, and I can go and I can pay a freelancer to go in and do 100 reviews and make them all positive. So it doesn't hold water. That aspect doesn't necessarily hold water anymore. But there's obviously much more to marketing communication than just reviews. Corporate responsibility is another key piece, again linked to crisis and reputation management. I suppose it draws on this factor with the FT alluded to as this idea of corporate communication sometimes being the conscience of the company. So corporate responsibility is around what when the organization should do the right thing as opposed to doing things right. And investor relations is not to be sniffed at. As you saw with the Berkshire Hathaway example, it's all about investor relations because that's their primary activity, is identifying a business, buying into a business, and keeping that business over time so that it grows and it spins off cash to invest into other businesses. So those are the elements that are included in corporate communications. I showed you this slide last week around some of the elements of business information. Again, I'm not going to read through it again because it's far too long, but this is a legal view. But if you look at what I've highlighted down the bottom, in terms of to the extent of it, so information could be held about historic, current, or currently planned affairs. It could be around operations or assets or liabilities, customers, licensees or contracts, research and development, or financial condition. I'm working with an organization at the moment to try and help build its business and activities. And one of the core ideas that we're looking at doing is how we license their core technology. So this is an established business. It's got a really interesting product. 70% of its business has been in Dublin, where I live, but the same need arises across the country and, in fact, across Europe and the world. So the challenge is, well, why isn't that business scalable? So one of the challenges we have to look at is we can't do it all. So we either need to grow organically or we need to find a way to extend the growth. And the way we're looking at doing that is around licensees, right? Finding a franchise or a license model to extend the business. So there's lots of different types of information and uses of information that we have to be aware of. Which sort of brings me on to the types of information. So this slide, again, it's similar to the previous one around what's included. This is to do with the types of information. So this is not definitive or complete by any means. We can talk about sales literature, right? We could talk for 10, 15 minutes about any one of these things. We could talk about HR files, business plans, governance information, training documentation. The point is that there's lots of different types of business information. This class, the PowerPoint that you're looking at, some additional documents that could be added to this class or that will be added in the leadership class later on, are all types of business information from a training point of view, for example. Okay, if we were having a meeting about a new project where we're all working on a global project team to advance a particular business process, then the information that we share, for example, maybe a project plan, maybe a product specification or a service specification, maybe information around projections for revenue or for costs, all of that would be business information. And it would really help us in terms of how we shape and we move our project forward. I think what's really interesting is this bit down here, this SOPs. So let me just highlight this here. We don't think about this that often, but standard operating procedures, whether it's flow charts or procedures, if we're in any sort of business where we're producing a product or we're repeating a service, we need to have some sort of documentation that says what we do. So that can be quite important, and yet in small, medium-sized businesses, we don't necessarily do it, or we do it on the back of an envelope or on a piece of paper or something. Whereas the bigger, more complex the business gets, the more focus we have to put into that, because that becomes the infrastructure upon which the business runs. Equally, if we're talking about information for our customers, product specifications becomes very important, because that's what we have to rely on. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and their challenge was they sold a product from their store, and 5 days later, a sizable value product. 5 days later, the person came back and said, "Look, I'm returning this." And of course, normally you sell a product. There's nothing wrong with the product, just the person didn't want it. Normally, you sell a product, that's it. But actually, on their terms and conditions on their website, they had mentioned, or somebody had put in this thing, that there was a 7-day cooling off period, so the customer was entitled to rely on that situation. So you need to be clear about what information you have, and it needs to be tested and validated over time too. So then, if we talk about business information types, well, I'm not going to get into this in too much detail. This is more of a worksheet for you as the learners to work on. But if we talk about sales information types, well, we might talk about sales volumes. We might talk about by channel. We might talk about pricing. Okay. We might talk about production in terms of, again, production quantities, right? Or batch quantities. Okay. We might talk about stock to be held, and what does that mean in terms of stock holding and stock taking, in terms of how many piece parts are held in stock, how many of sub-assemblies or how many of raw material elements. If we talk about human resources, again, we might talk about HR files. We might talk about job descriptions. We might talk about performance reviews. Okay, and those performance reviews, well, they might, our information on human resources might come from performance management meetings. They might come from sales reports, for example, if the person is in sales. Again, so there's lots of different sources for these different types of information. And of course, if we think about the use of this information, we might talk about, from a HR point of view, it could be around coaching to improve performance, or it could be to do with bonus payments linked to performance. So there's lots of different types of information, source information, and uses of information that we need to be brought into. So if we take all of that forward, we think about the structure of corporate communications, the purposes and the types, and then the communication process. Again, we showed this slide last week, this idea of sender, encoding, message, channel, receiver, and decoding. That's an iterative process. It's an ongoing process, and it can fail at any one of those stages. So if we're going to be effective in terms of business communication, we have to understand the process, and we have to keep base checking that process for the range of activities that we're talking about. And we need to realize that when we get information and the way we use information can be affected by and can be impacted by a failure in the communication process. So what are the characteristics of business communication then? And again, this is building on last week. It's a continuous process. I don't think there's any way to get away from the fact that this is a continuous process. And as a continuous process, business communications can improve. It should never be something that we don't look to improve upon. It needs to lead to proper understanding from the recipient of the communication, whether that's a staff member, in terms of how their performance is working and how their performance needs to improve, or if they're a salesperson, in terms of missed opportunities for sales or in lead generation, or if they're involved in a manufacturing process or a building process, information that enables them to continue to deliver product or services effectively. There's a story told, maybe apocryphal in some ways, about Harley Davidson. So Harley Davidson is, of course, the eponymous motorcycle manufacturer. Harley Davidsons are wonderful motorcycles. I gather. I haven't ridden one, so I don't know. But certainly they are, the Ferrari of motorcycles in some ways, except of course if you're talking about Kawasaki or Suzuki or so on. But Harley Davidson was going through a problem about 20 years ago. The quality was not good. Like with many American companies, they were being well beaten in the quality stakes and the performance stakes by companies from abroad, from Germany, for example, from Japan, etc. Harley Davidson had a problem with quality. And to fix that, there was a change in leadership at the top. And to fix that, it wasn't a quick fix. They had to change the understanding about what they were about and who they were. So the story is that the chief executive came in and he made the point that, look, if anybody is building a Harley Davidson motorcycle and they feel that the quality is not right, they have the opportunity and the obligation to stop the line, to stop the production line. So this was a real test because, of course, if anybody's worked in manufacturing, there's always a big pressure to get stuff through the production line, get the product out the door. So one particular individual is working on Harley-Davidson and has to ship. It's a Friday afternoon. It has to ship because the customer's waiting on it. And he wasn't happy with the product. And his supervisor said, look, we have to get this out. It has to go. And he said, I'm not happy. And the supervisor insisted, this needs to go. So the guy said, no. So he rings up the chief executive office and he said, look, I'm working on this bike. It's not ready. We need to stop it going out the door. The customer needs to be delayed. And the chief executive backed him and said, well, this is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be clear about what our quality is and improve our products and our outputs. So he backed the guy from the production line, and that really sent a very strong message across the company about what was really important. So it gets into that proper understanding element. And that leads to achievement of organizational objectives and change. And of course, if you have an icon or a story like that, that can really set the tone for the organization in general. And that sort of enables that sort of quality improvement to become pervasive in nature across the organization. If we talk about the methods then of business communication for all of the bits and pieces we've talked about, well, and again, we'll get more into this because in particularly in week 4, we talk about being much more effective. The methods can be written, obviously, paper, email, verbal in terms of communications face-to-face, meetings when you might have 3, 4, 5, 20 people in a room together, presentations or events, presentations like this slide deck we're going through. There can be speeches and briefings, on topics that are important to the business. It can be business newsletters or bulletins. Even more so, it's becoming things like social media, like WhatsApp. So I'm involved in a couple of different organizations, and in one of them, WhatsApp is a central tool. It becomes a central resource. So somebody has something to say or some message, it goes up on the WhatsApp group, everyone in the group gets it. So there's lots of methods and channels. It's about picking the right method, the right channel, and the right message to make the communication effective. And what we'll do next week is we'll work through some examples, some process examples, start to finish, in terms of how we get to effective communications. And we'll take some of the examples like the Harley-Davidson one, and we'll show how that works going through those processes. If we pull back then to corporate information at the top level, we talk about things like governance and finances. One of the challenges is we have too many scandals. We had this earlier on in the session. There are too many scandals that occur, and this can have serious impacts for organizations in terms of reputation, etc. So there's rules for corporate information, rules around finances and accounts and stuff that has to be produced. And depending on the size of the organization, certainly in Ireland, for example, there are thresholds. If your revenue is below a certain level, you have this requirement, and if your revenue is above that level, you have further requirements. But they need to be to standards and so on. So you have audited accounts and statements of compliance. So all that information has to be reduced to the right level and then shared effectively. So these are rules. There are rules that underpin some of the communication elements that have to be complied with. I'm going to park that slide because we're a little bit short time, and I'll come back to that next week when we talk about a bit more about culture and change. And if we talk about presenting information effectively then, so just to pull forward from, for example, some of the methods of communication, and okay, it might be corporate information or it might be customer information. Presenting information really means we need to understand the communication process about, like the Harley-Davidson example, who we're trying to communicate to. In that case, it was the workforce. What we're trying to communicate to, which was the importance of quality in the business, how we communicate it, where we tell stories and we illustrate the examples that help us drill home as to exactly what's important. When can also be important. Like there's no point in slipping, and we've all done this, I suppose, slipping in a bad report at the end of the day, 4:30 on a Friday or 5:30 on a Friday evening because, we just get it in, get it done. Hopefully it'll be forgotten about by Monday. It needs to be effective. It needs to be heard when it needs to be heard, as soon as it needs to be heard. And we also need to be clear on why we're doing the information, why we're providing it. I want to finish with just one extract from Warren Buffett's piece. I'm a lucky fellow to have you as my partner. So on his website, Buffett had this voter support from his shareholders. I'm not going to read it because we don't have time now, but I'll let you read it and we'll pick it up next week. And it's really to do with the fact that they were going to issue a dividend for the first time ever, and the shareholders decided no. And that was a real vote of confidence for the business. All right. So the recap is we've talked about corporate communication. We talked about the types of corporate communications, and we've talked about corporate or business information types that might be applied or might be dealt with through those corporate communication channels. And we'll pick it up again next week when there will be no sound issues. I'm going to make sure of it. Thank you very much. And I will see you in a couple of minutes in the marketing class. Okay.